Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And in my loosely sketched out plans for this show, I was planning on covering this album last month. I figured it would fit. The band that many people attribute to the breakout of horror punk with a video set for around Halloween, it's almost too easy. But then my plans kind of went awry when you all wanted me to cover Husker Du, and fair enough, I totally get why. But I still hope that I would get a chance to discuss this band in particular, especially as we're dealing with two very unique facets. Not only were they the band that really broke horror punk, but they're also an example of a band that started out in more traditional punk rock before shifting into hardcore, which wasn't really all that common in the early 80s. Normally it was the other way around, with hardcore punk bands expanding or shifting their sound either towards crossover thrash, punk rock, post-punk, or even just outright alternative rock. But this band was a little bit different. In the late 70s, in exchange for a trademark with Mercury Records, they got enough studio time to hammer out an album that wouldn't see release until the 90s, and like most punk bands around the turn of that decade, they saw most of their success coming off of the singles. But they had built a lot of notoriety in the scene for an increasingly exaggerated and macabre image, along with reputation for criminal antics and a rotating cast list of members. By 1982, they had managed to push out a proper debut album that had won some acclaim for solid melodies and a distinctive schlock horror theme in their songwriting, but the band was in mid-collapse even then, and the frontman Glenn Danzig had confided in his friend and the frontman of Black Flag, Henry Rollins, that he was planning on just quitting the band himself and starting something new. By 1983, Glenn Danzig was even including a couple songs he was intending for a future band on this sophomore project just to push the album through to completion, and yet it wouldn't be enough. The band would break up 2 months before this album's release after a disastrous Halloween show, and they would not reform in any capacity until the late 90s, leaving behind what some have deemed a hardcore punk and horror punk classic. Yeah, folks, we're talking about Earth A.D. Wolf's Blood by the Misfits, and this is Resonators. So alright, I feel there are a couple qualifications that need to be made surrounding this album in particular. Not excuses, although hardcore punks have given Danzig way more chances than he's deserved over the decades, but really the context in which this album was made. Because even if I didn't know that the Misfits were in mid-collapse in making this album, the increasingly rushed and slapdash construction of this project, it will give the impression that at least some people were in a hurry to get the hell out the door. And here's the second major qualification. Even at their best, it was never all that wise to take the Misfits all that seriously. They certainly played up the image in a lot of their marketing and promotion, not to mention their live shows, but their songwriting was primarily derived from B-movie horror and sci-fi schlock, and the Misfits certainly didn't seem all that interested in mining any greater insight out of that. But you know what, that's okay. This was a band that built their debut off of strong melodic hooks and a lot of catchiness. They weren't trying to be edgy or all that dark like Black Flag on their debut, or nakedly provocative in the same vein as the Dead Kennedys or the Dicks. In short, the Misfits made hardcore punk that you could conceivably call fun, at least in their first album. But just because I understand why this album sounds the way it does, doesn't mean I have to like it. And we might as well get this out of the way right now, or it's going to overshadow this entire show, even by the standards of hardcore punk that I have covered on Resonators. The best thing I can say about the production here is that it's inconsistent. Spot might have been credited as a co-producer along with the band here, which is really just Danzig, but little of the wiry consistency, the firm bass lines, and the jagged definition that he typically gave his production shows up here at all. Frankly, I'll give him credit for whatever quality in the mix we do get, however spotty that is. The fuzzy crunch of Doyle's lead guitar propelling the melody more to the forefront, at least behind the rhythms sometimes, Robo's aggressive snare work, and occasionally Danzig's howl can sound pretty credible. And let's not ignore that a fair few of these songs are pretty solid. The Misfits can write good melodies. The sharper grinding riff of Death Comes Ripping, which does pick up some sort of misshapen groove, the charging sizzle of Green Hell, the more defined hook of Blood Feast, and, of course, the most immediately recognizable single of Die Die My Darling, which is easily the best song on the album. But let's not mince words. The bass lines are muddy if they're present at all, the kick drums sound muffled and buried behind cymbals that are way too loud, and you would think for the whole cult of personality that Danzig has built with his lyrical content, you would be able to make out what the hell he's saying more often, his voice be closer to the front of the mix. And again, I'm expecting lo-fi tones and rough edges. There's a difference between sounding well-produced for your genre and sounding polished, and I'm not asking for the latter. But even when you compare this to their debut album, Walk Among Us, the production sounds slapdash, rushed, and for the most part, it's just a total mess, compromising many of the better melodic grooves in favor of speed that doesn't hide how messy some of the interplay between the guitars and the bass and the drums actually are. This is a pretty slapdash album in composition and execution too. So yeah, production is a problem. All the more glaring given the stronger melodies on their debut, which I will say is a better album. But you know what? This album was still critically beloved at the time, so was it something about the content? Well, at first glimpse, I was inclined to say that was laughable, but opting for more aggressive, minor key tones does take the Misfits' horror punk direction to slightly different territory, where I can see some of the lasting appeal. Where the schlock that characterized their debut was more pulpy and campy and really accessible, this was the project where the volume got turned up a little bit, as the first two songs dove straight into a bloodbath on Earth AD and rampant sexuality with Wasp Queen, and the third is literally about a devil that Danzig himself describes as cancer. Oh, sure, you still get old school horror iconography like werewolves on Wolf's Blood, but there's more attention played to the grisly details this time around, which you kinda need in order to give these songs any bit of an edge, so why not go for it? And I'll admit that the rougher edges and increasingly blood-stained writing does inspire a certain grindhouse exploitation feel that is entirely up my alley, a mood that, say, Discharge didn't quite manage to grab with their apocalyptic gorefest. But at the same time, it is hard to avoid the feeling that some of the writing was just as slapdash and rushed, and this is where we have to mention a larger frustration that really comes with Earth AD Wolf's Blood in particular: the structure. And as I've said, Danzig has outright admitted that songs like Death Comes Ripping and Blood Feast, they were both intended for his future band Samhain, and the sharper production and the writing focus on those songs definitely stands out in contrast. You can tell he's putting more effort into that project. And that's before I tell you that the Die Die My Darling single, it was not on the original pressing of this album at all. It was only tacked onto the cassette and CD later. Now look, this was not uncommon in a lot of hardcore punk, but it does showcase how much of this project in particular was just cobbled together in post. A few stronger songs surrounded by a lot of messy fragments that weren't well written or distinctive, or even fully fleshed out as songs to stand on their own. And yet, there was an audience that considered this album a hardcore punk classic, or at the very least a cult favorite. A little bit less so nowadays, given how the Misfits have reformed and put out more material of middling quality at best, and how much Glenn Danzig has squandered so much goodwill. But you know what? They were there, so we need to ask the question why that is. And I'm honestly not sure that there is a clear and complete answer to this. Probably a combination of limited supply of this subgenre, the punk tendency to ignore sloppy production and instrumentation if the energy and fervor was there, and honestly it is, and the fact that for this brand of horror punk, the Misfits were charting new territory, and they do get a little bit more leeway in that department. And some of it likely came from the lead-in of a great debut album, a wild live show, and a quickly canonized legacy thanks to breaking up before anyone got the clue of greater flaws that would pop up in spades in the decades to come. But you know what, going back to Earth AD and Wolf's Blood, while I can appreciate the darker, more aggressive follow-through that does show something of an evolution from their debut, with the benefit of decades of hindsight, it's impossible to ignore the slapdash structure, the messy production, and the generally rushed experience of this album. If the band hadn't broken up when they did, I don't think this would get nearly the same critical acclaim, because it's a desperate Hail Mary pass of an album that failed to save its band and won acclaim because it tried. And while I can respect all that, yeah, I didn't quite like this that much. Light 6 out of 10 and only recommended for the diehard fans, or if you're curious about the origins of horror hardcore. And it's not a bad project by any stretch, but it's absolutely a compromised one that even today leaves open the questions of what might have been if Misfits had stuck around. So if you're curious on that side of their legacy, give it a listen. It's not bad. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. This is a bit of a weird review. I wholeheartedly admit this, even for Resonators, because I just don't have a lot to say about this, and honestly, it's a little too scant on details, or really scant on quality songs to get much into this. Again, if the Misfits didn't break up when they did, I don't think a lot of people would call this a classic, and I've seen some retrospective reviews that have come down pretty hard, and yeah, I gotta admit I might be one of them. But hey, you want to buy or stream the album if you can find it. I got links down there below. Keep in mind that the links don't always manage to capture the full album because this record is actually pretty hard to find outside of certain collections. And hey, I got the poll up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, guys get to add albums, movies, or even the top 10 list to that schedule. Coming up on the last month of 2018, that means I got year-end lists coming there, so you want more details, so pay attention there. You want to see my schedule, link down there below on my Instagram. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse and Resonators, and I'll see you next time.